Our next guest is researcher and PhD student employed by the Stockholm School of Economics, Fanny Almersson. The Stockholm School of Economics is the leading business school in the Nordic and Baltic countries. Combining her love for research, business, sports, and equality, Fanny has been working on understanding the inner workings of one of the most successful women's clubs in the Nordics. I'm your host, Lorraine Moalusi. Join me as I interview Fanny Almersson to understand more about how one of the most successful women's clubs in the Nordics is driving change in how women's sports business is conducted. Fanny, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm so much looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to this as well. And before we begin, we like to start off our sessions with an icebreaker. Are you ready for that?
Go ahead.
What's your favorite quote, expression, or motto, and why is it your favorite?
It's a difficult question. I think I have many, but I think one quote that I really like is from Emma Watson's speech in the UN, and I think it also relates a lot to why I'm here today and what I'm doing in my research. So I think she said something around the lines of men. I would like to take this opportunity to extend your formal invitation. Gender equality is your issue too. And I think it captures how we all benefit from a more inclusive society, also the ones that might seem more privileged from the start. And it highlights how we need to work together in order to achieve that. And I really like that about that quote.
Yeah, and it also shows that it's not a man versus women issue, but it's an everyone issue.
Exactly, exactly.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. What was the inspiration behind pursuing a PhD in sports and particularly in the women's sports business?
I mean, I played football myself when I was younger, and in many ways, I think that has also formed who I am today. So I learned a lot through football. I learned teamwork. I got a lot of friendships. Learned how to work hard to achieve things. It gave me an amazing relation to my dad, who was my coach until I was about 14 years old. Um, so it taught me a lot, and I think like my main inspiration is that I want to make sure that more girls could have that in the future. So when I was 19, I started studying at the Stockholm School of Economics. And that's when I first, so I didn't play football serious any longer, just a bit for fun on the side. And that's when I first got in contact with the Center for Sports and Business here at school. It was founded around the same time as I started, so around 2015, 16. And I started working there as a research assistant and helped out with a lot of their events. And that led to me then eventually continuing doing a master's and now stay on as a PhD student, also connected to the Center for Sports and Business. So, yeah, that's how I ended up where I am today. So.
You must really like it then, because it's been how long? It's almost 10 years later and you're still
Yeah,
looking.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. In the end, when I'm done with my PhD, so when the PhD thesis is ready, I will have been here for 10 years. So,
yeah.
yeah, it's quite a long time, but it goes by fast if you're having a lot of fun, and I think I am. So, I really love what I'm doing.
To be honest, that's one thing that I found really refreshing about Sweden when I first moved to Sweden. I found that you find a lot of people who've been in jobs for like 10 years. You find a lot of people who've had friendship groups since they were in preschool. And
Yeah.
that's a very foreign thing for me because I've lived in 5 different countries now. So I
Mm.
really admire when I see people being in the same place for a long time because I know how deeply the passion and the love and the roots grow then.
Yeah, I think if you find your passion and you know what you want to do, I don't see why you would need to go somewhere else.
Mm,
Maybe a little bit every now and then in order to be exposed to different environments. I think that's always good, but
mm, mm.
it's always nice to come back. So.
Absolutely. And before I we continue, maybe let's talk a little bit about your PhD research, because I mentioned in the introduction that you're studying one of the most successful women's clubs in the Nordics, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the scope of your research and any other details you're able to share.
Yeah, so my PhD is a case study. So that means that I will work on the same project throughout my entire PhD period of 5 years. So now halfway in. And during my first 2.5 years, I've been collecting a lot of data, and I've been interested in women's football. So that's been the interest of mine. And when I started my PhD, uh, there was one very successful club in women's football in Sweden. They broke the Swedish audience record, and when they did that, that's when I realized that this is the club I want to study, because I want to understand how the Swedish football go from in the old days being a very masculine thing. It's been difficult for women to succeed in football. It hasn't been seen as professional, and being a football player on the women's side has not been considered as a job, as your main job. So a lot of the players have previously had other jobs on the side. Um, and I started to see a shift where football in the Nordic countries uh, is becoming increasingly popular, uh, gaining more commercial interest. So we go from a setting where women's football has been something we're doing because we're doing it for good. Uh, and suddenly it seems like the football club starts to see a business opportunity in engaging in women's football. And I wanted to understand, like, what's the challenges with doing such a journey, like what are the opportunities of doing this, but also could imagine a lot of tensions along this way of ending up where we're more and more as of today. So that's why I started this case study. So around that club, I've then been talking to managers, players, coaches, sponsors, investors, a lot of different stakeholders in order to understand more.
Hmm. And in Sweden, much like in the US, the women's team is much more successful than the men's teams
Mm.
on the field when it comes to particularly football. Do you think, and in the US, they're really doing a great job of trying to leverage that on-field performance to boost their income and revenue. For example, now they have like the highest, I think they have a broadcasting deal of about 240 million US dollars, which is much, much higher than what they've previously had. So they're really, really working hard to leverage their on field performance off the field. Do you think Sweden, what kind of job is Sweden doing? Are Sweden doing as good of a job to really leverage that performance that women have to boost the development of the sport?
It's a difficult question because I think historically Sweden has been very, very good when it comes to women's football. So very high up in all the rankings. When it comes to men's football, we're not performing as well internationally. So I think right now Sweden is in a very critical situation of where they need to rethink a lot of things in order to keep their attractive international position. So we've seen just the latest years how in Sweden we're starting to sell players also internationally to bigger leagues such as Premier League, for example. So some of the Swedish players have gone to some of the very successful Premier League teams. So I think we're in a critical position where we really need to do our best in order to try to keep that and not fall behind and become more and more like men's football in Sweden, where maybe we're selling players to another club like Portugal, Belgium, Denmark before they are taking the next step to go to the really big ones. But it's
Mm,
also difficult because some of these bigger clubs on the men's side, they have so much more resources than
Mm.
the Swedish clubs do. So, I mean, in my case, I'm also studying a double club, so a club having both men's and women's football. And I think that is also what we're seeing happening in England, for example, where it's the men's clubs going in and taking over women's football. So I think
Mm.
it will more and more start to look like on the men's side. So for Sweden, I think it's just important to be quick and make sure you're following the international progress. But because I think internationally, a lot is happening right now, so it goes very, very fast. And with the Swedish club having less resources from the men's side, I think we need to leverage the position we have today in order to keep our position in the
Mm.
value chain. So I think that will be very important for the Swedish clubs going forward, and it will especially be a challenge for the women's only clubs that maybe need to focus more on girls' academies, how to develop players in order to be able to keep up when these big giants come in with more resources.
Hmm. And the double clubs are a bit of a contentious issue at the moment, in that some people are wondering if we have seen from the numbers that leagues, women's leagues that go independent from the men's side, tend to do much better than leagues that are sort of controlled by the same entity that also controls the men's side. Um, so if we're seeing that they're getting much more better performance in terms of commercial, in terms of resources that are coming into the league itself, why then are women's clubs, like the individual clubs themselves, not trying to break away from that model of being sort of a double club, right? And I'm just wondering if you have an opinion on that kind of model. Should women's clubs try to stay independent so that they can really run their clubs the best way that they know how to, instead of just copying what's already been done? And also that conversation of, are they getting disadvantaged because in a big club, like in a double club, Arsenal men versus Arsenal women, probably, maybe, now this is just an example, maybe Arsenal men are getting more resources than Arsenal women. So what's your opinion on that sort of conversation?
I mean, I think that a lot of these men's clubs from before that they are starting to move into women's football. I think that's in general a good thing. Uh, on because it means that women's football is becoming more important. But I think what we need to do is we need to work together. So we need to make sure that there's room for both, because I think there is a value to it, because a lot of the women's club are also coming with a lot of history. So I think we need to exchange our knowledge in order to make sure that we can, us as a league, stay on a very high and attractive position. But I think what's also interesting in Sweden is, like you talked a bit about the league position. So the in Sweden, we've had a men's league organization and a women's league organization. But what also becomes interesting there is the question of, should there be separate league organizations, or should they go together? Um, so in the example of Sweden, I think there's now people are now starting to ask the questions of, why are you two separate organizations? Because I think there are a lot of synergies of going together. So especially in regards of sponsors, I think. So when I've been talking to sponsors of this club that I'm studying, I see that a lot of them are putting more and more emphasis on women's football. And they are not just doing that as a good cause, like they used to do a while ago. So they are more and more starting to evaluate the business value of having women's football as well. So I talked to one sponsor who said, for example, that it was a very strategic decision to go in and sponsor this club when they had a women's team, because they could then launch women's fit on their products. um, Another one that said that, I mean, we're on the women's games, they are selling more. So in general, um, the audience going to watch women's football are buying more on the arena. So maybe there are slightly different types of fans, although they are, of course, also overlapping. So that is something that is making it very attractive to go together, both as a club and as a league organization in terms of the sponsor revenues. But it also puts the clubs and then potentially the league organization in a very tricky situation if they would also do the same, because it means that we also need to decide on a club level, do we want to measure profitability of men's and women's football individually? Uh, and the club I'm studying, they've decided to do that because they want to evaluate whether it's profitable or not, since it's becoming more and more of a business case. And there the question is, how do we allocate our resources if we do that? So ticket sales, quite easy to allocate. We know how many are going to each of the games. We can easily see that. Um, Same things with player transfers. We know whether we sold a women's player or a men's player, but then the question becomes, okay, but commercial revenues then? How would we allocate that? Uh, some say, what happens um, when when we're getting a new sponsor? Are they coming in to sponsor women's football or men's football? Some of them say both. But then the question is, okay, what happens if we would not have women's football? Probably we would lose a lot of sponsors. But what happens if we would not have men's football? We would also probably lose a lot of sponsors. So it's a combination of both that makes them go in to sponsor the club. And it's very difficult then for the club themselves to put an allocation key on how much should be allocated to each of the two teams. So they try, in the club I'm studying, they try to do these calculations to actually calculate, is women's football profitable? And one the sales manager in this club, he actually did a calculation, but then he presented the calculation, and some other people in the club says that, oh, but I don't agree with the assumptions you've made around this calculation. So is it really this calculation, or is it another calculation? And this whole idea of whether women's football is profitable or not is becoming more and more important, especially when clubs are no longer investing in women's football just as a good cause. They do that as well, of course, but also for the sake of it becoming more and more of a business opportunity. So I think that is a very, very important question that becomes huge for these clubs that are making this shift.
Absolutely. I mean, I could ask you so many questions just based on what you just said, because like I think like one of maybe an unfair comparison that I make is between the US and Sweden, where we know that they have very different structures. In that in Sweden we have the 51% rule, right? And then in the US it's like you can own a whole sporting organization, and they have a much more sort of assertive, because I don't want to use the word aggressive, business mindset, where it's like the question of should we measure profitability is something that they would think about before they even like start or purchase a women's club, because they're thinking, how are we going to become profitable, right? But I guess they're very different. It's apples and oranges, so we can't really compare in that sense. But thank you so much for sharing, especially about all the calculations and the assumptions that are being made when making those calculations, right? Because we say numbers don't lie, but most of the time we assume things when we present numbers, or we present numbers in a particular narrative that then sort of skewers the way that, yeah, that tilts the messaging towards one side or another. Absolutely. So we live in a time where information is abundant online about anything, and sometimes reality can be quite different from what one reads, and just like I did, sometimes the comparisons that we make are not quite correct. Has anything surprised you regarding expectations versus reality, or were the challenges and opportunities that you started to identify throughout your research exactly what you were expecting?
I think if I just may start by addressing how you talk about the difference between the US and Sweden, I think that's super important. And thank you for bringing that up, because I think we also need to look at where we are and what's the environment we're in. So the setting and the context of where we're operating is very, very important. So I think Swedish football is very different from US football, which is also then different from Asian football, for example. So I think in Sweden we have this whole, like, the community, the 51% rule, members owning the club, a lot of like the fan culture is very, very big in Sweden. So I think those things will also be important in making these decisions. So a lot of the decisions we will need to take is also actually based on the identity of the club and the league and the country we're in. So thank you for bringing that up. But in regards to if anything has surprised me, I think what has surprised me in relation to that is that we have this very, very strong fan culture in Sweden, and the fans of the club that I'm studying, they are also very becoming very, very engaged in women's football. So you can see how they are also a big part of the success of the women's football club. But I think what is interesting here is that I thought that it was more organically developed, and I didn't so much think about how much work the club is actually doing internally in order to foster that inclusive environment of fans for both the women's and the men's team, and how they try to support this through. So they have an idea where they say that we want to become one football club. So that's their whole what the project is called, in order to integrate men's and women's football. And we often read about this external fan engagement, especially for this club, getting people to the stadiums. But I think what the club has done is also, for example, such an easy thing as they've decided to report equally much uh, on men's and women's football when it comes to, for example, social media. So they say, okay, we're gonna do 50-50 on social media when we talk about men's and women's football. And following this club, you can see how in the beginning there was some tensions, and there were some fans saying, oh, why are you reporting so much on women's football? I was a supporter of the men's team from the start. But also, since this club is very successful in women's football now, how this mindset is also starting to change just by them being very persistent with their idea of that we're one club, we're men's football club and a women's football club. So now you can see a shift in how the fans are also talking about the women's team, where they're even making jokes in the comment field about when the men's team is losing. They say, "Oh, shouldn't we let the women's players play instead, and maybe we will win the match? Or should we have the women's coach coaching the men's team instead, maybe?" So I can really see a shift in fan engagement, but a lot of that's also driven by the very hard work that the club is trying to do in order to integrate the two teams.
Wow, wonderful. You say so many things, and then I get carried away to ask many different questions, but I will keep moving forward.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
in your research, you interview many different stakeholders in the sports business ecosystem, including the managers, players, and sponsors. What other perspectives have you been gathering, and what is the significance of this approach instead of focusing on one or two stakeholder perspectives?
Mm. I mean, I've been trying to gather the perspective of as many stakeholders as possible around the club in order to understand the whole value chain and the whole field, so to say. So when it comes to my case, I think this is very, very important, especially as women's football is growing so fast. So there will be a lot of actors involved, and they will have different opinions because they have different goals and they have different aims. So I think it becomes very, very important to find a compromise, and to see when are these opinion clashing and when are they becoming more and more similar, and how can we do in order to foster some sort of agreement where we have a common goal and a common agenda. So I think therefore I really like to have a perspective where I look at all these different stakeholders and when they are making trade-offs, because it's not so straightforward, even though they have the same goal. I mean, all of them wants to engage more with women's football, or at least most of them, and there's not so much a question of uh, what do we want to do, but it becomes a question of how do we get there. So I think it adds a perspective that I really like. So one thing that this club has done in order to try to unite all these different stakeholders is that they've said, okay, it's very hard, this question of resource allocation, for example, is the women's team profitable or not? Is that what we should focus on, or should we say we want to be top 3 when it comes to men's football and when it comes to women's football? And when they are doing that, they can more and more start to unite around a common goal and a common agenda. But then, of course, still you would have questions then around, okay, but what does it take to be top 3? How many resources do we need? How large does the player budget needs to be in order to achieve that? So I think it becomes very, very important.
And as a researcher, it's your job to try to remain as unbiased as possible. But have there been any biases or opinions that you've held quite strongly that you've had to really lay aside in order to really research this in a non-biased way?
I mean, I had my experience from being a player going into this case. So when it comes to interviewing the players of the women's team, I could recognize a lot of the things that they said. So, for example, they talk a lot about how they are so very thankful for just getting some attention, getting some resources, people wanting to work with them. So I could recognize a lot of that. So it becomes important to also then be able to take a step back. But usually I think about the bias as some of my strength. So when I go in to interview the women's players, I could relate with them. I know what the questions to ask also, and that goes to managers and sponsors as well, because I really know the context of what Swedish football on the women's side looks like. So I try to see it as a strength of me in order to be able to ask the right questions and put the right focus. But then I also have a supervisory committee. So I have my main supervisor, Martin Carlson Wall, and 2 additional committee members. Um, and I think they are getting a very important role when it comes to this question, because they can sort of bring me out of my own little world of how I understand women's football and what my assumptions are going into the context, and they can really question me on the things that I find and that I think is interesting. Like, is this interesting because you're interested in women's football, or is this actually interesting from a research perspective? Is this becoming important for the
Mm,
entire industry? So I think that's been very, very important for me to have this group of people that are trying to support me, but also trying to bring me a bit further away from the field. So yeah.
mm, mm. Um, And maybe to try to, as we bring this conversation to an end, to give some practical tips to other women's clubs that are trying to also break attendance records, also improve their commercial success, and leverage the success that they have on the field, off the field. What kind of advice would you give them when it comes to really improving in these areas?
I think it's in general it's very hard to give advice. It's hard to tell them what to do, but I can definitely bring up some of the tensions and challenges I think they will meet, and that they need to think about when they want to go from being a men's club and improve women's football and so on. So especially in relation to the double clubs that I am studying, I think the first thing for them would be this question of resource allocation. So, should we try to measure the performance individually for men's and women's football? For what purpose are we doing that? Uh, if we're doing that, how are we then going to allocate our commercial revenues, and same with overhead costs? Uh, I think that's very very important to think of. How big should the player budget be? I mean, you have you might decide on a common goal, but what does it take to get there? So and also in relation to other women's clubs, what's their player budget? Can we compare where do we want to be on the scale? Um, I think another interesting thing that we didn't talk too much about now is also how do we commercialize our players? Do we do it do they do it individually, or do we do it more as a club? So one thing I've also seen is this tension between the sponsors of the club and their commercial partners versus the commercial partners and sponsors of the entire team. So one example I had was I interviewed one player telling me that she was sponsored by a drink company, and then the club goes in and sign a new contract for the entire club with a drink sponsor, which means that she can no longer have this contract individually, and that is also quite a big hit on salaries on the women's side when they are getting uh, some of their money from individual partnerships that they also might have through their agents. And that becomes an important question of, okay, how much should we steer this as a club? How much should the individual players do? Because then you also have the question of, you have star players and you have the players that are not seen as stars. And for them, they say that I don't want to sell myself. I am not good at that. That's not who I am. I'm here to play football. I'm not here to be a commercial star. So they rather want to be commercialized by the club. So that also becomes a very important tension that these clubs need to look at and think about. They also need to look at what's the economic value of a supporter. I think that is becoming increasingly important. How much do the audience going to men's versus women's football actually pay when they're at the arena? Because there we can see an increase in on the women's side. Um, Pregnancies, what happens if our players in the women's team get pregnant? This is a new issue. We haven't seen much of that before. Uh, how should we budget for it? Should we replace the player? Should we not? There are some guidance from league organization when it comes to this, but it's still rather new, especially for players deciding that they're gonna come back to football afterwards. How do we support them? And then I think what becomes important when we're talking about all these questions is this a question that I brought up earlier on identity. So who are we as a club? And I think this differs in between clubs of how we would answer these type of questions, because we need to consider how important is our history. What's the history of women's football in our club? How can we communicate that to our fans? What about social media reporting for both the men's and the women's football on the same account? Would that bring additional value to us? What's the history of our women's and men's arena? Where should we play women's football? Um, Also, where should we train when it comes to women's football? And where are we operating as a club? Uh, should we have united training facilities? Should we go on training camps together? And what is our sports goal? Like, where do we want to be a winning club? Where do we want to perform when it comes to sports? I think a lot of these other questions could also, they're also relating to this question of identity and who are we as a club. And I think for football clubs, especially with a very strong fan culture, this becomes important.
Hmm. Wow, you're so eloquent. I could listen to you all day. But Fanny, we need to close this now. First comes this research, and then what comes next? I mean, I haven't read the research and you're not done with it yet, but from what you're saying, it's quite fascinating and interesting. And you're uncovering so many question starters. Like, I'm sure that if you had all the answers, you'd give them all to us. But the stuff
Mm.
that you're saying makes us question things, and hopefully, the people that will read them in the end, they will get a chance to reflect and be a bit more intentional. So, what are you hoping to do after this research?
Yeah, it's the big question. So I just want to highlight also that all these decisions that we've talked about and everything around women's football, that's decisions made by people. So I think like making sure that you're valuing the people you have, but also considering what people do we need in order to work with these questions. I think that will be also super important in order to succeed with women's football. So the club I'm studying, they have a full team of some people working more specifically with women's football on their agenda, and I think that's brilliant, and that's really what women's football need. But when it comes to what I'm doing in the future, I think first of all, I hope that this will result in a practical report as well. So I will have my thesis, which will be done in about 2 years' time from now, hopefully. That will be a book. So there is a lot of issues around women's football. So instead of writing research articles, I've decided that I'm writing what's called a monograph. So there will be a book focusing on this entire case, and that will be my PhD thesis. But also to release a practical report quite soon, because I'm starting to get ready with my field work, and now I'm digging deeper into the research side of things in terms of literature and previous studies and so on. So I hope to provide a practical report quite soon, where clubs can learn and hopefully take some inspiration in order to understand how they would handle and increase the value of women's football also for them. So I think the common goal is just to make sure that we can increase put women's football on the agenda. And I hope that this report will help more clubs to do that, and hopefully also some league organizations, because I think a lot of these things transfer on a league level. But apart from that, I hope that in the future I will also do more similar research projects, where I learn more about other things relevant in the sports
Mm.
industry. So that's what comes next. So my thesis, a practical report, and then after that, new interesting research areas, hopefully also within the field of sports, but maybe focusing on other issues such as, I don't know, I think parasport has been very interesting in terms of diversity and inclusion. I also transgender we haven't talked about, but I think that's also something that will be interesting for the sports industry. So, yeah, I hope for also some future projects in the sports setting.
Wow. Wow. I wrote a chapter on women's sports in a book that we published last year for the company, Data Talks. I'll be sure to, you're in Stockholm, I can bring you a copy. We're here for you if you need
Thank you very much. I would love
anything.
a copy. That would be great.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And Fanny, where can people reach out to you if they, like me, enjoyed listening to you and listening to your insights? Where can they connect with you?
I would say the best place to connect with me is probably LinkedIn. I would try to post as much as possible also when we're releasing reports and studies in relation to this women's football project. There they can also see if I've been speaking at some events. So we had our Center for Sports and Business Partner Day just a week ago, and all sorts of things in relation to that. So my personal LinkedIn, and then also the LinkedIn of Center for Sports and Business, I think is the best way to connect in order to stay updated on the work we're doing. And then of course you can always email me. I would be happy to talk to people with similar interests.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure to put both links to your personal LinkedIn and to the sports, was it Sports Business Center?
Yeah, the
Sports
Center for Sports and Business
Center for Sports.
at
Yeah, we'll
Stockholm
make
School of
sure.
Economics. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll make sure to put both links in the description. But thank you so much, Fanny, for coming on to the podcast. We had so much trouble trying to record this, and this was our second take, and it went well. So thank you so much for your patience, and thank you so much for your generosity.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely. I'm looking forward to talk more in the future.